Ibrahim Traore was the son of a mine worker. His father died in an explosion at a gold mine operated by a French company, and the family received no compensation. The company didn't accept responsibility, and the Burkina Faso government remained silent 30 years. Later, Traoré visited the same mine as the leader of his country. As the French manager proudly described production figures, Traoré asked him just one question: how much do you pay Burkina Faso when you extract a ton of gold? The answer: 2 million francs. Traoré shook his head. You're wrong. The amount you'll pay is now zero because you won't be here anymore. 1 week later, the boldest decision in Burkina Faso's history was announced, and Western powers responded harshly, but they didn't know about Traoré's long-prepared plan. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Bissa gold mine, 100 kilometers north of Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, for just 7 months stepped out of his modest vehicle, declining the umbrella and aid offered the assembled executives from Nordex Mining, the French-Canadian consortium that had operated the mine for nearly 4 decades. Waited nervously. This unannounced presidential visit had caught them unprepared. Mr. President, welcome to Bissa, began Philippe Moreau, the mine's French director, extending his hand. We're honored by your unexpected visit. Traoré's handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Director Moreau. I've been meaning to see this operation firsthand. Something in his tone made the executives exchange glances. This wasn't a routine diplomatic visit. As they walked toward the main facility, Moreau launched into well-rehearsed talking points. Our operation here employs over €200 local workers, he said proudly. We've invested €430 million in infrastructure and equipment since 2008. Traoré nodded, his eyes scanning the massive open-pit mines stretching before them, a vast wound in the earth terrace, with heavy machinery extracting tons of ore daily. And your annual gold production? Traoré asked. Moreau smiled, pleased to highlight their success. Last year we extracted 12.3 tons of gold, our best year yet. Market value of approximately €720 million. They reached a viewing platform overlooking the processing plant where ore was crushed and treated with cyanide to extract gold particles below them. Workers in hard hats moved about, tiny figures dwarfed by the industrial machinery. Traoré stood silently for a long moment, watching the operation. Then, without looking at Moreau, he asked the question that would later be remembered as the beginning of Africa's gold revolution: and how much does Burkina Faso receive for each ton of gold you extract from our soil? Moreau hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. We pay all required taxes and fees according to our contract, approximately 2 million CFA francs per ton, plus employment benefits to the local economy. Now Traoré turned to face him directly. 2 million francs from 60 million in value, just over 3%. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. Tell me, Director Moreau, would France accept such terms for its own resources? Before Moreau could answer, Traoré continued, this mine is where my father died 30 years ago. There was an explosion in tunnel, 623 workers killed. No compensation was ever paid to their families. I was 7 years old. The revelation hung in the air between them. Moreau shifted uncomfortably. Mr. President, I wasn't aware. That was before Nordex's current management. We have excellent safety records now. Traoré cut him off with a raised hand. I didn't come to discuss the past, Director. I came to inform you about the future. He turned back to the view of the mine. His decision already made. Your company's presence in Burkina Faso will end in 30 days. The contract is terminated. Moreau's face palled. Mr. President, you can't. Our contract runs until 2040. There are international agreements, protections. Traoré's voice remained level. 60 days, then, out of respect for the logistical challenges, but on day 61 this mine will belong entirely to the people of Burkina Faso. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back toward his vehicle, leaving the executives in stunned silence. That evening Morrow made frantic calls to Paris and Ottawa. By morning, the French Foreign Ministry and the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs were both demanding emergency meetings with their Burkina Faso ambassadors, but this was just the beginning. What no one yet realized was that Traoré's visit to Bissa wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was the first public move in a strategy years in the making. 7 days later, Ibrahim Traoré addressed his nation from the presidential palace. The speech was brief, direct, and revolutionary. For too long, the wealth beneath our soil has enriched foreign shareholders, while our people remain in poverty. Today, we reclaim what is rightfully ours. All foreign mining operations in Burkina Faso are nationalized effective immediately. He outlined a 60-day transition period, during which foreign companies could remove their personnel but not their equipment. This is not a request or a negotiation, he concluded. It is the sovereign right of Burkina Faso to control its own resources. The era of resource colonialism is over. Within hours, the international response began. Western media outlets decried economic suicide and radical expropriation. The French government threatened immediate sanctions. The Canadian Prime Minister called it theft on a national scale. The United States State Department issued a formal condemnation, but what these powers didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Traoré had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Long before becoming president, as a mid-ranking military officer with a degree in geology, he had built a network of specialist technicians and international allies who shared his vision of resource sovereignty. The nationalization was an impulsive act of defiance. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy with multiple contingency plans. In a secure conference room deep within the presidential palace, Traoré met with his closest advisors the day after his announcement. Defense Minister Ouedraogo looked concerned. Mr. President, French military intelligence has increased activity around our borders. There are reports of mercenary recruitment in neighboring countries. Traoré nodded, unsurprised. Activate security protocol Delta and inform our Russian and Chinese partners that we are moving to phase 2. Finance Minister Cabaret spoke next. The World Bank has frozen all development loans. The IMF is threatening to revoke our standing agreements. Western banks are suspending correspondent relationships with our financial institutions. Again, Traoré showed no surprise. Implement the alternative banking channels we established and announced the new gold-backed currency next week ahead of schedule. What followed was a masterclass in strategic national resource management. While Western powers expected Burkina Faso to crumble under international pressure, Traoré's government executed a series of moves that left observers stunned. First came the revelation that over the previous 2 years, hundreds of Burkinabe engineers and technicians had received specialized training in mining operations, many in Russia and China, but others in Brazil, Turkey, and even discreetly in Canada and Australia. We don't need foreign expertise to mine our own gold. Traoré explained in a national address. Our people have been doing the actual work for generations. They were just never allowed to manage or profit from it. Within weeks, every major mine in the country had transitioned to national management, with production continuing largely uninterrupted. The expected technical collapse simply didn't materialize. Next came the financial counter-move as Western banks cut ties with Burkina Faso. The country unveiled its new currency, the Sankara franc, named after the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, who had been assassinated in 1987. Unlike the CFA franc, which was guaranteed by the French treasury and effectively controlled by France, the new Currency was backed directly by gold. Reserves now under national control for the first time we control both our natural resources and the currency that represents their value. Finance Minister Kaber explained to journalists the international financial establishment predicted hyperinflation and economic collapse. Instead, the Sankara franc maintained remarkable stability, and neighboring countries began accepting it. For cross-border trade, first Mali and Niger, then Guinea and Togo. The most surprising aspect of Traoré's strategy, however, was his diplomatic approach. Rather than adopting a stance of total isolation from the West, he maintained open channels with specific partners who recognized the legitimacy of resource sovereignty. When the French foreign minister threatened military intervention during a press conference, Traoré responded not with matching rhetoric but with a simple invitation. Come to Ouagadougou, see our operations. Negotiate new terms that respect both your interests and our sovereignty. This calculated openness created divisions among Western powers. While France maintained a hard line, Canada began discreet talks about technical partnerships under the new framework. Several European countries, including Italy and Spain, signaled willingness to respect the nationalization in exchange for preferential purchasing agreements. The United Western Front that had initially condemned Burkina Faso began to fracture. Most significantly, Traoré leveraged alternative international relationships masterfully. China, already deeply invested in African infrastructure development, quickly offered technical support and equipment. Russia provided security assurances and military advisors to deter potential destabilization efforts. Turkey, Brazil, and India, emerging powers with their own histories of Western economic dominance, established new trade agreements that reduced Burkina Faso's dependence on traditional partners. 6 months after the nationalization announcement, Ibrahim Traoré invited international journalists to tour the Bissa gold mine, the same facility where he had first confronted Director Maro. The contrast was striking. Where foreign executives had once occupied air-conditioned offices, Burkina engineers now managed operations. The mine's safety record had improved, and new profit-sharing system distributed 15% of revenues directly to workers. We produce slightly less gold than before, admitted the new director, a woman who had previously been a middle manager under Nordex, but the profits stay in Burkina Faso. We are building schools and hospitals with money that once went to shareholders in Paris and Toronto. Most tellingly, the mine now included a memorial to those killed in the explosion 30 years earlier, including Traoré's father. Each name was engraved in gold-flecked stone, a permanent reminder of the human cost of resource exploitation. As months passed, the dire predictions of economic collapse gave way to a more complex reality. Burkina Faso faced genuine challenges: technical expertise gaps, equipment maintenance issues, and the need to establish new export relationships. Yet the catastrophic failure that Western analysts had confidently predicted didn't materialize. Instead, a new model of resource management began to emerge. Imperfect but undeniably Burkina. The true genius of Traoré's approach became evident in the way mining revenues were redistributed rather than centralizing control in the government. He established the National Resource Trust, a public entity with constitutional protection, managed by a combination of elected officials, technical experts, and representatives from mining communities. Every citizen received quarterly reports detailing gold production revenue and expenditures. Transparency is our shield against corruption, Traoré explained. When everyone can see where the gold goes and what it pays for, it becomes much harder for anyone, including those in government, to divert resources away from the people. The trust allocated funding according to a formula enshrined in law: 30% to infrastructure development, 25% to education and healthcare 20% to future, diversification investments 15% to a sovereign wealth fund and 10% directly to mining communities. The international response continued to evolve. France maintained sanctions but found itself increasingly isolated as other nations normalized relations with Burkina Faso. The World Bank and IMF, after initial punitive measures, began cautious re-engagement. Most surprisingly, several international mining companies, recognizing the irreversibility of the new paradigm, approached the government with proposals for technical partnerships under the new national ownership model. 1 year after the nationalization, Ibrahim Traoré addressed the United Nations General Assembly. Western diplomats had expected fiery anti-colonial rhetoric. Instead, Traoré spoke with measured confidence about a new framework for resource management in developing nations. We do not reject partnership, he emphasized. We reject exploitation disguised as partnership. The difference is fundamental. The speech resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. In the following months, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo all announced reviews of existing mining contracts with foreign companies. Latin American nations with significant lithium deposits began studying the Burkina model as they considered how to manage their strategic resources. The economic revolution that had begun with one question at the Bisa gold mine was spreading. Perhaps the most profound impact, however, was on ordinary Burkina citizens. For the first time, they began to see tangible benefits from their country's natural wealth. New schools opened in remote villages that had never had formal education facilities. Rural health clinics received regular supplies and equipment. Roads improved, connecting previously isolated communities to markets and services. Solar power projects brought electricity to regions where it had been an unimaginable luxury. My father died extracting gold that built nothing for his community, Traoré remarked during a visit to a new technical training center in his hometown. Now that same gold is building a future for the next generation. That is the meaning of sovereignty. The training center specialized in mining engineering, geology, and sustainable resource management, preparing young Burkina to control their resources for generations to come. Not everything went smoothly. Technical challenges persisted in some mining operations. International financial restrictions created ongoing difficulties for certain imports. Security threats emerged from various quarters, including mercenary groups funded by unclear sources. Yet with each challenge, Traoré's government demonstrated remarkable adaptability, reinforcing public confidence in the nationalization project. 2 years after the historic announcement, a delegation from France arrived in Ouagadougou. This was not a return to the old relationship, but the beginning of something new. After extensive negotiations, Burkina Faso and France signed a resource partnership agreement that allowed French technical involvement in specific projects under entirely Burkina ownership. The terms were revolutionary compared to the previous arrangement. French companies would receive fees for services and technical support, but all resources would remain national property. It is a model that respects both our expertise and their sovereignty, admitted the French Minister of Economy in a press conference that would have been unimaginable months earlier. We are learning to be partners rather than proprietors. Similar agreements followed with Canadian, Australian, and American companies, each recognizing the new reality that resource-rich African nations would no longer accept the exploitative terms of the past. The gold revolution, as it came to be known, transformed more than Burkina Faso's economy. It fundamentally altered the psychology of the nation's citizens, who had been taught for generations that foreign expertise was essential for development. Saw their own engineers and technicians successfully managing complex operations communities that had watched resources leave their soil for decades now witnessed the direct benefits of local control. Ibrahim Traore became known internationally as the architect of a new resource paradigm. But within Burkina Faso he emphasized collective achievement. This transformation belongs to every citizen. He insisted during the second anniversary of nationalization no single leader could have accomplished this. Alone it required the courage and commitment of an entire people who decided their resources should benefit their children. Perhaps the most poignant moment came when Traore visited his father's village, where a new secondary school had been built using mine revenues. The school specialized in science and technology education with modern laboratories and computer facilities. My father had to leave this village to work in a foreign-owned mine. Traore told the gathered students, "You will be able to stay here and still participate in building our nation's future." The Burkina model of resource sovereignty spread rapidly across Africa and beyond. Within 5 years, 14 African nations had implemented versions of the National Resource Trust, each adapted to local conditions but sharing the core principles of transparency, diversified investment, and prioritizing community benefits. The previously unquestioned dominance of multinational mining corporations in developing nations began to erode Western nations, and international institutions eventually adapted to the new reality. The World Bank created a sovereign resource management division to support countries transitioning to greater national control. The IMF developed alternative financial frameworks that didn't punish resource nationalization. Even the most resistant multinational corporations began offering new partnership models that acknowledged national ownership while providing technical expertise. 10 years after his confrontation with Director Morrow at the Bisa mine, Ibrahim Traore stood before a gathering of African leaders in Addis Ababa. Many had followed Burkina Faso's example, reclaiming control of their natural resources and redirecting profits toward national development. The true revolution, Traore told them, isn't simply changing who owns the mines, it's changing who benefits from what comes out of them. The statistics told a compelling story. In the decades since nationalization, Burkina Faso had transformed from one of the world's poorest nations to a lower middle and own country. Literacy rates had increased from 41% to 78%. Access to healthcare had expanded from covering 23% of the population to over 80%. Infrastructure development had connected previously isolated regions to the national economy. Most significantly, the percentage of mining revenue remaining within the country had increased from less than 10% to more than 85%. Challenges remained. Of course, Burkina Faso still faced security threats, agricultural challenges, and the ongoing need to diversify beyond mining. The country wasn't a utopia, and Traore himself acknowledged that resource management was just one element of a complex development landscape. Yet the fundamental relationship between the nation and its natural wealth had been transformed irreversibly. The ultimate validation came not from international recognition but from the changing landscape of Burkina Faso itself, where foreign mining companies had once extracted resources with minimal local development. New communities flourished. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure appeared in regions that had been neglected for generations. Technical training centers prepared young Burkinabe for specialized careers in their own resource sector. Most touchingly, the children of mine workers, who had once looked forward to the same dangerous, underpaid labor as their parents, now had different futures available to them. The son of a miner could become a mining engineer. The daughter of a processing plant worker could become a geologist or environmental specialist. The cycle of exploitation that had defined generations was finally broken when asked about his legacy in a rare, personal interview. Ibrahim Traore reflected on the journey from his father's death in the mine to the transformation of his nation. I didn't start with grand ambitions to change international resource politics, he admitted. I simply asked a question that had bothered me since childhood. Why does our gold make others rich while we remain poor? In finding the answer and the courage to act on it, he had sparked a revolution that extended far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. As the interview concluded, the journalist asked one final question. What would his father think of modern Burkina Faso? Traore was silent for a moment, gazing out the window at the transformed capital city, where new buildings, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure stood as physical manifestations of reclaimed resource wealth. I think, he said finally, he would recognize that his death in that mine was not meaningless after all. The gold he died extracting is finally building the future he dreamed of for his children.